Dr. Yao for a fantastic overview on the approach for accelerating global pediatric development. We will now open it up to the audience for questions. Dr. Yao, you mentioned real-world evidence. What do you think the most important applications of real-world evidence are, and how can we utilize real-world evidence to increase efficiency for pediatric drug development?
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak and to have a question and answer session. I would just first say that there's no question that's too small or too big, so feel free to ask it. Now's your chance. And I will also thank you, Lynn, for the question on real-world evidence. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, and I was thinking that maybe we would have some questions, so thank you for asking it. You know, in reflecting on this very, very popular term right now, real-world evidence, and how that's going to be used, I think, you know, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that everybody thinks we can get to, right? Or that winning lottery ticket is that, oh, I will just pull together some patient data that I have collected from, you know, electronic health records, and I don't have to run a clinical trial anymore. And presto, I got a drug approved. And I think that that maybe is, you know, certainly something that could be considered down the road, or when we have a lot more experience and practice with how we can reasonably use real world evidence. But just because we won't necessarily say, yeah, go ahead, collect some patient data out of EHR and, you know, we'll get your drug approved. Just because we're not saying necessarily that that's, you know, the appropriate way to go right now in any specific pediatric drug development program, doesn't mean that there's really important application for real world evidence. And one of the first places where I think real world evidence plays an important role right now, that is in the data that we are collecting and we are really expecting sponsors to collect to support the similarity of a disease between a reference and target population. So, you know, that's a place where we do believe, and we have seen, I think, sponsors doing diligence to say, look, here's some information we have both from records from patients, adult and pediatric, and we want to show you how, you know, their clinical course is very, very similar. And it mirrors what we already know in the published literature. So that's one application. I think the other application is in, you know, the understanding of the pathophysiology or the effect of a biomarker, you know, all these steps along the way. And then finally, I do think we're moving towards the idea that you could create a reasonable story, right? You could collect enough information that would justify or support use of that external data to consider an external control, an historical or non-concurrent control in certain situations. That's also already been done. So I think that real world evidence, you know, we're at the tip of the iceberg here. And I do think that there's going to be tremendous application in children. I just think that, you know, there are stages along the way that we should be thinking about it actively, and not just that, oh, well, if I do this, I won't have to run a clinical trial.
Great. Thank you very much. We have another question. So what can we do within our organizations to encourage use of these innovative approaches in pediatric drug development programs?
Really good question. Yeah. You know, from my perspective, and this is, again, maybe the same thing that I try and say every day at work, which to the teams at work, to the other divisions, to my colleagues around the globe, and to sponsors. Look, if you have the question, you have the idea, you think about the innovation, ask it, right? I think that, again, I had a question the other day. I recently did another seminar within FDA. And one of the questions was, you know, does it really make sense to apply innovative approaches and try to decrease the clinical trial requirements in a disease in which we already have many, many patients we can study? And the path is very well worn. You know, we don't necessarily have to innovate in certain areas, like, for example, atopic dermatitis, asthma, ADHD. These are conditions historically that we have plenty of pediatric patients. But I would also argue that there are ways that we can innovate even in those spaces, and that if we can decrease the trial burdens, the requirements, that even in those areas where we have many treatments, when the new ones become available, we want to make sure that children have access to those as soon as possible as well. So I think that there is no space where innovation can occur. And so what I would say is, in your organizations, particularly for the sake of children, what innovations that you've heard about, and not limited certainly to the few things I've spoken about today, but what innovations can be applied to speed and to increase the efficiency of pediatric development in those areas that you're working on?
Great. So we have another question, and this is pertaining to common commentaries. So just for a bit of clarity, is there any kind of legal requirements, or as far as responsibilities for the sponsors with respect to whether or not that advice has to be followed on the sponsor side, and really if you can expand a bit more on that.
Absolutely. And that's a great question, because I did not really go into much detail in the common commentary. Let me start by saying, firstly, that the reason the common commentary program, I think, has been successful is because it allows us to provide timely feedback to sponsors. We have a meeting in which the product is discussed or the issue is discussed, and we try to issue those common commentaries really within 30 or so days of the meeting. So sponsors get real time, as close as possible to real time feedback about the discussions. But in order to have that quick turnaround time, we also very clearly state that these recommendations are recommendations only, and they are non-binding. So there is no requirement for sponsors to follow that. There's no requirement for the sponsors to have to, justify or reply formally, but it is intended to help provide clarity in regulatory thought across regional authorities. So, and we think that that's helpful to sponsors, but in no way is that binding. The second point I want to make, although it's not directly related to this question, sort of related, is that we've heard in the past that it would be really helpful, and sponsors have been requesting that they be allowed to attend the cluster calls in which their products are being discussed. And that request is, we understand in very good faith that, sometimes regulators don't quite get a detail that maybe the sponsor could clarify. But in really thinking about how the cluster functions, we have as a group of regulators decided that it's really not in the best interests of the cluster to have sponsors entering the calls. It's very difficult to maintain confidentiality for their product and for others if you have people sort of popping in and popping out of the call. So at this point, we have not agreed, and we don't, in the near future anyway, intend to allow sponsors to attend the cluster calls. Nevertheless, we do think that what we're doing is still, I think, useful, and we've heard very strong feedback that they've found common commentaries to be useful.
Great. We have a question here on Bayesian modeling. Can you explain in a little more clarity really what is meant by Bayesian modeling and how that is then applied to pediatric drug development?
I think that's a great lead-in question to, I think, the next session, where my colleague and friend Skip Nelson is going to be talking a little bit more about application of Bayesian strategies and methodologies in the pediatric extrapolation approach. In fact, we have had several forays into the use of Bayesian approaches in as part of pediatric extrapolation, and one drug that was approved in 2019, Benlysta, which I think Skip is going to talk about briefly, in which FDA took a post hoc Bayesian approach. And this was, again, to look at a tipping point analysis. So borrowing or leveraging adult data from a control trial to see at which point, how much borrowing was needed to achieve a treatment effect with different levels of confidence. And he'll talk more about that. But I'm not the expert in terms of the actual mathematical methodology, so I would be probably straying too far into areas I don't know enough about to say more than that. But let me just say that at a very high level, the idea that that there is ability to leverage existing data in a statistical analysis plan that can be leveraged to support substantial evidence of effectiveness in a pediatric extrapolation approach.
Great. We have another question, and this is pertaining to number of children. So do you see the number of children involved in clinical trials to keep decreasing, specifically as we increase this data-driven predictive modeling approach in early stage development? And also a lead into that is, how does that impact on evaluation for safety? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, another really good question. And I don't want to steal Skip's thunder. So I think he's going to talk a little bit about the safety side too.
Okay.
But yes, look, a lot of the extrapolation work in the last 25 years has been, how can we maximize efficiency, keeping in mind that efficiency is important, because the longer it takes to develop a drug and get it approved for children, the longer there is an absolute requirement for off-label use, right? And that's not helping children, that's not helping prescribers. On the other hand, if we come out and decide to approve a drug and we don't have sufficient safety support, or that we don't have enough data to support the risk-benefit analysis, we're not doing children any favors either. So it is true that we're actively considering, in an approach where maybe you say, look, I'm okay with you matching an exposure that was effective, that led to, efficacy and safety in adults. And if you match that exposure and identify the dose that works in, the pediatric patients 6 and above, we're done. Maybe that's 12 patients, maybe that's 25 patients. But then you're saying, well, that's a single arm, maybe even a single dose or steady state PK study. How much safety can you glean from that exposure? And how much more safety do I need to have confidence that we've evaluated the safety completely or thoroughly? And that's a question that needs to be asked. And I don't have an answer, because that needs to be justified and considered on a case-by-case basis. It may very well be that after 25 patients of PK, we have enough collected safety data, because we know it's been used in other programs or in other approved ways in children, that we don't need any more safety. Or we may say, 25 is enough for the PK, but we believe, because we have this specific safety concern, that you might need to collect additional safety. So I think that the question has to be answered, and it should be answered separately from how much information you're collecting on the efficacy side, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need more safety always.
Okay, great. So we have a question here on the lag. So to mitigate that 9-year lag in pediatric labeling, how can we predict dosing recommendations? Can they be made publicly more quickly, so that in relationship to approval of the drug?
I think that what we've done so far to try and improve the lag, and we still don't have the data out, we're going to be starting a project to look at this very question, right? How has the implementation of the PSP and certainly the PIPs in Europe, has that had an effect on, getting drugs and labeling to children earlier? Because the whole idea was that if we knew your plans earlier, we could have a discussion about your plans earlier, and that hopefully would lead to fewer delays, getting your non-clinical done, getting formulation work started. But even with that, I don't know how much of a dent we're making. And so we want to actively look at to see if in earlier discussion of study plans has led to improvements in that lag. But I think I would ask the question back to, the folks assembled, and maybe we could talk about that in one of the panel discussions. Well, what can we do in our individual organizations or in your companies to make sure things are set, or that we have the appropriate strategy in place, and that we have reached agreement with regulators on the type of study design that will work? And maybe there's less of this, well, we'll just do an adequate, well-controlled trial because we think that's what FDA wants. And then FDA says, yeah, that looks like it's okay. And then 5 years into it, you realize you can't enroll. It's not a feasible trial. And then we've got to, go back and start. And we'd like to avoid that as much as companies would like to avoid that.
Okay, great. And then we have time, I think, for just one last question. And this pertains to participation of FDA in 2 pilot projects, the RTOR and Orbis, that's been successful recently for utilization in lung cancer drugs in adults. Is there an application that could be seen for pediatrics?
So I'm going to leave that question up to my colleague, who's also, I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but Dr. Greg Riemann is also going to be speaking and part of this amazing couple of days. I think that there is absolutely potential for Project Orbis to be used on a pediatric program, but I think to date so far, FDA is always looking at what are those potential high impact drugs and how can we potentially use a coordinated review strategy to get it out to the world at the same time. So I think that there's definitely the potential there for its use in a pediatric application.
Great. Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Yao. And now we're going to be hearing about innovative techniques towards extrapolation and efficient drug development.